Today we're out here taking a look at the 2019 Honda Pilot, Honda's biggest crossover in America. This is also one of the few three-row, 8-passenger crossovers because for some reason even larger crossovers than the Pilot often seat either 7 or even sometimes 6. The Pilot is a very important vehicle for Honda, not just because this is one of their most popular crossovers, but also because the Pilot provides the basis for their Ridgeline pickup truck and of course the upcoming Honda Passport, which we will be driving in late January. For 2019, they've applied some tweaks to the 2016 model, so this is basically the same model that we last reviewed, only we have a new front-end grille, we have a new 9-speed automatic transmission that has mainly software changes, although there have been a few hardware changes, a new infotainment system, and some styling tweaks here and there. The front end is instantly recognizable as a modern Honda. We have this large chrome bar that runs from one side to the other, and there's that large Honda logo right there in the center. We have LED reflector headlamps that are standard, and this is styled a little bit differently than the last Pilot that we looked at. We have LED fog lamps available down below. Overall, the refresh was designed to bring the look in line with what we see in the new Honda Accord. I think they've done a good job at that, but they've also tried to make it look a little bit distinctive compared to the related Ridgeline and, of course, that new Passport. Even though the Pilot is Honda's largest crossover in America, and even though this seats 8, while some of the larger vehicles seat 7 or 6, this is actually on the small end overall for a three-row crossover. Something like a Chevy Traverse, the Dodge Durango, the Volkswagen Atlas, they're all considerably larger than the Pilot right here. This slots in the lower end of this particular segment, along with the Toyota Highlander, which also seats 8, and the Kia Sorento. As with most new Hondas in America, their all-encompassing active safety system is standard on all trims. They're calling it Honda Sensing. That gives us adaptive cruise control thanks to the radar sensor behind that large Honda logo. And of course, we have a camera right here behind the windscreen, which helps give us lane keeping, road departure mitigation, and auto high beams. Probably the most important feature in the Honda Sensing package is the autonomous braking system, because the collision mitigating braking system, which is what Honda calls that, operates at higher speeds than many of the competitive auto brake systems. If you move on up to the EX trim or higher, then we also get blind spot monitoring and rear cross traffic detection. Under this hood, we find just one engine. It's a naturally aspirated 3.5-liter V6 engine. That means that you don't have to worry about upgrading from a base 4-cylinder engine that may be less powerful like we see in the Toyota Highlander or in some of the other competitors. Every model of the Pilot has this same engine. It's mated to either a 6-speed automatic or a 9-speed automatic, depending on the trim level that you get. The upper end trims all have the 9-speed, the lower end trims all have the 6-speed. The 9-speed improves not only acceleration, but also fuel economy, and the most efficient versions of the Pilot will be with that particular transmission. Overall EPA numbers for 2019 range from 21 miles per gallon for the 6-speed auto and all-wheel drive, up to 23 if you get the 9-speed and front-wheel drive. Now it's worth noting that the all-wheel drive system in the Pilot is basically the same system that we find under the hood of the Acura MDX. It includes the only torque vectoring rear axle in this segment, which means that even though the engine is sitting across the engine bay like this, it can actually send more power to the rear axle than most of the competition, with of course the exception of the Dodge Durango or the 2020 Ford Explorer. The rear end of the Pilot features combination tail lamp modules, so we have LEDs for the parking lights and brake lights, and then incandescent bulbs for the turn signals. The backup lights, interestingly enough, are actually LEDs again. At the bottom of the bumper, there's a single exhaust tip down there. You'll notice we have a tow hitch receiver because the Pilot does have a fairly healthy tow rating for this particular segment. And like most three-row crossovers in America, the rear hatch is fairly vertical. Behind the rear hatch, we find 16.5 cubic feet of storage space behind the third row. That's fairly good for a three-row crossover, even including the larger entries in this segment. That makes it a little bit easier to put luggage like this 22-inch roller bag back here, or up to two 24-inch roller bags in our test. If I take this out, there's also a little bit of extra storage right here under the load floor, but not enough to put an extra bag. However, you can see that it is sized very generously because this 22-inch roller bag will almost fit right there under that flap. Of course, most three-row crossover shoppers are likely going to keep the third row folded most of the time. We pull the little webbing right there and then fold those seats forward. If you do that, then we get 46.8 cubic feet of storage space and room for up to 10 24-inch roller bags. When it comes to front seat comfort, I'm going to give these seats 7 out of 10 points. We don't have 4-way adjustable lumbar support, and you will find more adjustable seats in top-end trims of the competition. Keep in mind that we are driving the very top-end trim of the Pilot right now. We have a tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion. We also have a 2-position seat memory over there on the door, but we don't have the same range of motion for the passenger seat on that side. Moving to the second row, we find a generous amount of headroom and a reasonable amount of legroom, although overall combined legroom figures do fall below the new Subaru Ascent, the Ford Explorer, and that would be the older model, and of course even the Kia Sorento, which is on the small side for this segment. Part of that is likely because Honda has chosen to prioritize that larger cargo area behind the third row over combined legroom, which would be again front row plus second row plus third row. Overall, I'm going to give the second row seats 9 out of 10 points. We do have some nice touches back here in this top end trim, like built-in window shades right there in the rear door, although there are a few silly things like cup holders in the door, because when you leave a soda right there and then you close the door, the soda can spill out or tip over into the seat. We do, however, have some duplicate cup holders right here in the center console. Moving over to the right side, with this front seat adjusted for a 6'5" passenger, I still have a reasonable amount of legroom left. Like many three-row crossovers, the second row seats slide forward and backward to help you apportion space a little bit more equitably with the third row. Getting into the third row is pretty easy. We have an electric mechanism right here to tilt and slide the second row seats forward, but unlike we see in the Pathfinder or in the Volkswagen Atlas, you cannot leave a child seat latched into place and still gain entry to the third row. Those vehicles are particularly friendly for families with children in forward-facing child seats. If I move this second row seat all the way back, that's latched in place and moved all the way rearwards, you can see that even though legroom is not as generous as some, I still have about 1.5 inches left. When it comes to the overall third row comfort score, I'm going to give these seats 9 out of 10 points, because even though we have a little bit less combined legroom than some, we have a generous amount of headroom. Sitting back here and completely upright, I still have about 1.5 inches or 2 of headroom left. This is 3 inches more headroom back here in the third row than you find in the Toyota Highlander. In order for the math to work to make this a 7 or 8 passenger crossover, we have a middle seat right back here in the third row. Now, it's not the most comfortable seat because the middle section right there is not very large. We do have an independent headrest for that position, but the rear seat bench is very, very narrow, as you see also in the Toyota Highlander. Therefore, these seats are best reserved for small children, naughty adolescents, or of course your mother-in-law. Honda does, however, give third row passengers some air vents back here and then 3 large cup holders on each side. Because this is a refresh, not a redesign of the Pilot, the bulk of the interior is basically the same as the last model year that we reviewed. We have a 2 moonroof setup in this particular trim, one pretty standard sized one right here over the driver and front passengers' heads. In the middle here in the rear, we have a rear seat entertainment system. It's a single LCD screen, and then we have another large moonroof right back there over the second and a little bit over the third row. The driver and front seat passenger get height adjustable shoulder belts and 2-way adjustable headrests. The model that we're driving has perforated leather upholstery because these seats are both heated and ventilated. Instead of a traditional soft touch center console, the Pilot prefers independent armrests for the driver and front passenger. These ratchet up and down so you can have them in different positions. This actually reminds me a lot of certain minivans. The front doors are made from a combination of hard and soft touch plastics. Basically what you're seeing here in charcoal is a soft touch material and everything else is a hard touch plastic. This segment is really known for practical storage cubbies, and so we see that in the front doors. We have a variety of different bottle holders, a small tray right there where you can keep smaller knickknacks, and then a larger compartment down there at the bottom of the door. Moving over to the dashboard, we again find that mixture of hard and soft touch materials. So again, the charcoal section is a soft touch plastic. We then have some glossy black trim and then harder plastics down here for the tan sections. We have a pretty decently sized bin-style glove compartment. I was barely able to fit a larger tablet computer in there, although some of the more recent extra-sized tablets may not fit. Some of the 9-inch ones are probably good there, but the 10 and 11s might not fit. Moving over to the center of the dashboard, we have a center channel speaker right up there, just above this infotainment system. The big change here for 2019 is that Honda has updated the software, but they haven't updated everything to the same version that we see in some of the more recent Hondas, so we still have touch buttons over here for the home button, back button, and then a physical volume and power knob over here. As you can see, this is basically the same version of the software running in Honda's minivan, including their rear seat entertainment control right here. It's basically the same that we see in that other vehicle. And we get the same cabin talk feature that we find in that minivan as well. That allows the rear passengers to more easily hear what the driver is saying. It'll even transmit the driver's voice over there in the headphones if the people in the back are using the rear seat entertainment system. This features Apple CarPlay and Android Auto integration, as you can see here, but it's not standard. You do have to move up to the EX trim in order to get this particular software feature. Below the infotainment screen, we have the engine start-stop button, the controls for the 3-zone automatic climate control system. You can control the 3rd zone in the back by using this RR settings button right there, and then you can actually use the toggle to change that temperature independently, or you can lock the kids in the back out. We have a single slot optical disc player down there. This is a Blu-ray player for the rear seat entertainment system, although you can also play optical CDs if you want. Buttons for the heated and ventilated seats up front. Single USB input, 12-volt power outlet right there, and a wireless charging mat. There's definitely a lot of room there, so even some small tablets may fit in this wireless charging area. Continuing back from there, we have Honda's unusual push-button shifter. Drive is this button right here. We also press it again for the sport mode. Neutral is another button. Reverse is a different button that pulls backwards, and then park is this button right up front. Honda tells us that this button design takes up less room, but I'm not quite sure I believe that, although there is a benefit to this setup. If you leave the car in drive and you're lazy and you just press the engine start-stop button, you'll notice the car will automatically put itself in park. Also in this button module, we have a terrain management button. This allows us to change between normal, snow, mud, and sand modes. This changes the way the torque vectoring rear axle and the rest of the all-wheel drive system behaves. Then we have a button to disable the auto start-stop system that we find in this trim. 2 large cup holders over here on the right that are always open. Behind the cup holders, we have a roller cover for this large storage area. This texture kind of reminds me of 1980s wallpaper. This is a very large and deep storage bin. I was very easily able to fit a gallon of milk in there. There's a single USB charge-only port and a 12-volt power port as well. One of the other recent changes is we now have an LCD instrument cluster, similar to what we see in some of Honda's less expensive vehicles. There's still a physical gauge for the fuel level on the right and the engine temperature on the left, but basically everything else is being given to you by this LCD. It gives us our torque vectoring readout for our all-wheel drive system, our trip computer, the ability to see turn-by-turn navigation directions, your phone interface, maintenance, certain vehicle settings, etc. You can also use this to show or hide particular apps within that screen, and then we have a digital tachometer right there along the top. The steering wheel is the same basic 4-spoke design we find in all of Honda's larger vehicles. We have paddle shifters on the back, up on the right, and then down over here on the left. The controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system are on the right side of the steering wheel. This is the lane keeping assistance button, and then we have a button to turn on and off the steering wheel heater. On the left side of the wheel, we find the buttons for the infotainment system, track forward, backward, volume up, down, dedicated phone and voice command buttons at the bottom, and then you use the home button, the toggles right here, the back button, and the enter button to interact with that multifunction LCD. When shopping for a Pilot, it's important to remember that the base models are not going to be as quick 0 to 60 as the top-end trims, and it all has to do with the 2 different transmissions that are under the hood. Again, the top-end trims get exactly the same V6 engine. There's only one engine in the Honda Pilot. But because the 9-speed automatic has a much more aggressive first and second gear than the 6-speed, it ends up going 0 to 60 considerably faster. The model that we're driving went 0 to 60 in 6.7 seconds, which is fairly good for this segment, and this model is the heaviest. It is the top-end trim, and it has the super handling all-wheel drive system, which of course Honda calls by a different name. But really, it's exactly the same all-wheel drive system, and that is important when it comes to handling. But before I digress, the braking figure is 123 feet, which is pretty good for a 3-row crossover like this. You will stop a little bit shorter in something like a Mazda CX-9, which has notably wider tires, but this is definitely one of the more athletic 3-row crossovers available in America. And again, it all has to do with that all-wheel drive system. The key difference between this all-wheel drive system and the all-wheel drive system you find in literally every other 3-row crossover in this segment is that all of the power that is destined for the rear axle can be directed to a single rear wheel. And it's really noticeable when you get the Pilot out on a winding road like we're on right here, because it feels much more nimble. It feels smaller than it really is. And that's because by powering that one outside rear wheel, you can actually make the car turn in a little bit more crisply. In addition to that feature, this all-wheel drive system can also send more power to the rear axle even when the front axle is not slipping. And that's different than what we find in something like the current generation Ford Explorer or the Mazda CX-9. Those vehicles, unless there is front wheel slip, can only send 50% of engine power to the rear axle. And this vehicle, under certain circumstances, can send up to 70%. Now that's not 70% of maximum engine power, it's 70% under certain circumstances, with air quotes there of course. but it is still more than you find in the competitive vehicles. And again, that really helps the Pilot feel much more nimble than you'd expect for a vehicle this size. This all-wheel drive system has kind of an interesting side effect. It makes the Pilot feel much more engaging going uphill than downhill. And that's something I've noticed about Acura systems in the past. The reason is, again, because of that power-on torque vectoring ability. But in neutral handling situations, the torque vectoring axle isn't going to do you any good. And at that point, it comes down to the overall suspension design, weight balance of the vehicle, etc. So in neutral handling situations, you should expect the brand new, recently announced Ford Explorer to likely be better than this because it's a rear-wheel drive vehicle, has a better weight balance, so does the Dodge Durango. And of course, the Mazda CX-9 has much wider tires and a firmer suspension. It's definitely focused on just handling. This has the precision, the Mazda CX-9 actually has the grip. When it comes to the overall ride score, I'm going to give this an A-. I think the Pilot strikes a good balance between overall handling ability and overall ride comfort, but this is not going to be the cushiest entry in this segment. Something like the Toyota Highlander, especially in lower end trims, they're going to be a little bit softer than this, and something like the Nissan Pathfinder, although it handles fairly well, is definitely going to be softer. So if you're looking for something that's more comfortable on a long highway journey, the Nissan Pathfinder is going to be the better option there. But if you're looking for a good balance between overall handling ability and overall ride comfort, the Pilot strikes a good balance. This is a very well-balanced vehicle overall. And that's something that we've noticed out of Honda in the past. Honda does not necessarily make the sportiest vehicles out there, but they do a good job at trying to straddle that fence. At 50 miles an hour in our cabin noise test, this vehicle scored 71 decibels, which makes this fairly quiet for the segment. I'm going to go ahead and give this an A. You will find slightly quieter interiors in some of the competition, but not too many of them. Something like the very top-end Mazda CX-9 in its signature trim is fairly quiet for this segment, and some of the entries that have more luxury aspirations are going to be a hair quieter than this, but overall this is fairly good. Overall fuel economy in the Pilot is pretty average for this segment. We've been getting about 19.5, 19.8 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving. According to the EPA, this should be getting around 21 or 22 miles per gallon. So I'm going to give this a B- when it comes to overall fuel economy because it's not reaching those lofty goals, but I didn't really expect it to be honest. Most options in this three-row crossover segment tend to fall a little bit below those EPA scores. The reason is that the Pilot is a fairly large vehicle, and for average driving situations, you're probably going to be digging into the throttle a little bit more than you would in something like a Honda CR-V, and of course we have that traditional automatic transmission and a V6 engine under the hood, so fuel economy is going to be a little bit lower. The model that we're driving is equipped with Honda's auto start-stop system, but it is worth noting that if you live especially in a very hot climate and you want the cabin to be cool, then it's not going to be able to stop the engine when you're at a stoplight. It's not going to save you as much gas as you might think. In steady state highway travel, the Pilot is likely going to be doing a little bit better than the average that we've been getting here, but you probably won't be getting much above about 24 or 25 miles per gallon, even on a long highway journey. With the 2019 refresh, Honda hasn't really changed the substance of the Pilot too much, but that's actually not a bad thing, because the Pilot was always a fairly competitive vehicle. They've just helped keep things up to date, helped keep things a little bit fresher. The new infotainment system is definitely a step in the right direction for this vehicle, and overall the Pilot does an excellent job again of straddling the fence. There are other options in this segment that are going to be more fuel efficient, more fun to drive, a little bit softer out on the highway, but the Pilot is a very good middle ground. Despite being well equipped in the base LX trim with Honda sensing, the LED headlamps, etc., the Pilot is actually very aggressively priced as well at $31,450. Now keep in mind the LX trim is probably not the one that you're going to want, however, because you don't get Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, you don't get the blind spot monitoring, LED fog lamps, or automatic climate control. If you want those features, you do have to bump up into the $34,330 EX trim. That said, the EX trim is still a very good deal compared to the competition in this segment. The model that we were spending most of our time in was the top-end $48,000 Elite trim, which really is knocking on the door of some luxury and near-luxury alternatives. Before we move on, there are a few things you should definitely know about the Pilot. First off, the push-button shifter that you saw is only available with the 9-speed automatic, so that's only in the top 2 trims. The base model gets a smaller infotainment system than the one we saw in this video. It's the only trim that gets that tiny infotainment screen. If you want the one that we were looking at, you have to bump up to the EX trim. The panoramic moonroof is only available in the top-end trim. Other models with the moonroof get a much smaller one. So mid-level trims get an acoustic windshield, top-end trims get an acoustic windshield, and acoustic front door glass. That really helps improve the overall cabin noise score. So as you work your way on up from the base trim to the top-end trim, it will get quieter. Keep that in mind. Acoustic glass has a noticeable impact on overall cabin noise, especially wind noise. So as you work your way on up from the bottom trim to the top end trim, remember that the Pilot is going to get quieter, and our cabin noise score was done in the Elite trim. Our first competitor is the best seller in this segment, the Ford Explorer. Now we're going to breeze by the Explorer pretty quickly because Ford recently announced a brand new 2020 model, and it is completely different than the Explorer that you'll see on dealer lots right now. Since it's just been announced, we don't know too many details yet, but we do know that it will be rear-wheel drive, more like a Dodge Durango or a Chevy Tahoe. It will have an all-turbocharged engine lineup, a turbocharged 4-cylinder engine base, a turbocharged V6 optional, and likely some higher performance turbocharged V6s in the future as well. There's probably also going to be a plug-in hybrid model coming very soon, likely closely related to what we see in the Lincoln Aviator, and it's about the same size as the current Ford Explorer. Expect the Explorer to be very dynamic, fun to drive, but also expect it to be a little bit smaller on the inside than the outgoing model because of the new rear-wheel drive design. The Explorer has long been one of the most cargo practical entries in this segment, but we don't expect that to continue for 2020. Next up, we have probably the most direct competitor to the Pilot, the Toyota Highlander. The Highlander is kind of an odd duck in this group because it's less expensive by a hair than the Pilot, but it doesn't come with the V6 engine standard like we see in the Pilot. Instead, the base model uses an older 2.7-liter 4-cylinder engine and an older 6-speed automatic. If you want the modern V6 and 8-speed automatic, you have to work your way on up to $33,280, which is much closer to the Pilot EX than the Pilot base model. And at the moment, we don't have Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, although CarPlay may happen soon. We just don't have too many details from Toyota yet. In terms of overall handling ability, the Pilot handles a little bit better than the Highlander. It also feels a little bit fresher overall. I like the overall interior style better, and Honda has spent a little bit more time trying to keep the Pilot fresh over time, whereas the Highlander hasn't really changed too much since this generation was initially launched. Both the Highlander and Pilot are 7 or 8 passenger vehicles, although really both models should be thought of as 7 passenger vehicles primarily, because the 8th seat is very, very small. Both vehicles also feature optional captain's chairs in the second row, and that means that if you get those top-end trims with the captain's chairs and you want to put 7 people, you still have to put 3 people in the way back. The mid-level and lower trims, you can put 3 people in the middle and 2 people in the third row. That's going to be a much more comfortable way to carry 7. Now, both the Highlander and the Pilot aren't going to be able to store the kind of cargo that you find in the old Ford Explorer behind the third row or in the average minivan. So if you do plan on carrying a lot of people in your vehicle and you want the extra luggage, you're going to have to bring a trailer or break down and buy that minivan. One big difference between the two vehicles is that you can get an optional hybrid system in the Highlander, and that will definitely get considerably better fuel economy than the average entry in the segment. The Highlander hybrid has been very reliable and notably more fuel efficient than pretty much everything else out there in this 3-row segment. Next up, we have the Volkswagen Atlas. It's big, it's much bigger than the Pilot, and it's also very family friendly, as I noted before. Volkswagen has had a few stumbles with reliability, and honestly, the trim level lineup from Volkswagen is a little bit hard to navigate because the base model comes with a 2-liter turbo for $30,895, a very low base price. But the next step up from there is $34,095. That gets you the V6 and all-wheel drive. But then if you move one step beyond that model, you go back to front-wheel drive. Why that happens, no one is really clear. But Volkswagen's product strategy aside, the Atlas is a solid family vehicle. You have the ability to keep child seats latched into any position in the second row and still tilt and slide those seats forward to access the third row. So if you're one of those families that has kids under an age where they need to be in child seats, forward-facing child seats, and you still want to be able to use the third row, the Atlas is quite simply going to be easier to deal with than any of the other alternatives. The Nissan Pathfinder comes close, but you can only have a child seat latched into one position in the second row. The Atlas lets you actually latch 3 seats in the second row and still tilt and slide those seats forward. In addition, the Atlas has a very large cargo area in the back, very practical third row. We have a lot of legroom going on and reasonable V6 performance as well. Overall pricing is definitely in line with what we see in the Honda Pilot, and you can get some high-end features that you don't find in the competition, like a larger full LCD disco dash that has some really snazzy features borrowed from the Audi lineup. Next up, we have the Kia Sorento, which has long been one of my top picks in this particular segment. Like the Toyota, it has a 4-cylinder base engine, but Kia decided to make the Sorento a little bit different in base form than what we see in the Highlander. In the Highlander, that base model really is not that much less expensive than the Pilot, but you do get a lot less content. The Kia, you have a lot less content and a considerably lower base price. In fact, the Sorento is kind of a weird tweener vehicle when it comes to overall pricing, because starting at $26,000 or so, it actually is within the price range of the Honda CR-V in the base form, and goes all the way on up to the top-end pricing in the Honda Pilot, because you can get the Sorento up to about $44,000, $45,000 or so. The likely reason that Kia is doing this with the Sorento is that the Kia Sportage, which is the CR-V competitor, is on the small side for that segment, so they decided to have the Sorento try and straddle the fence there a little bit. It's also worth noting that the Sorento used to be available in base form as a two-row crossover, but for 2019, all versions of the Kia now have the third-row standard. The result of this lineup is that the EX V6 trim of the Sorento is the proper corollary to the Pilot LX and the Pilot EX. So when you start taking a look at standard feature content and you think the Sorento has a lot less standard feature content, keep that price tag in mind, because when priced comparably to the Honda, you get about the same kind of feature content. On the flip side, you do get a longer warranty. You also get an interior that actually is slightly roomier in terms of legroom, although headroom is a little bit more limited in the third row, and the cargo area is a little bit smaller. Overall, the Sorento is a neat and tidy package. It handles well. I think it looks pretty good, but it's not feeling quite as fresh as the Honda Pilot lately because it is getting a little bit older. Fuel economy is also a little on the low end. However, on the flip side, if you're starting to look at top-end trims of the Honda Pilot, like the Touring or the Elite, then the Sorento, I think, is a better value. We get more comfortable driver's seats, and we actually get a few more standard features in those top-end trims that we don't find available in the Honda, like a 360-degree camera system, and I think a slightly nicer appointed interior. We also get a higher grade of leather, and the ability to have a thigh cushion extension in the driver's seat. Speaking of the top-end trim, our final competitor here is the Acura MDX, because a lot of folks this week were asking me, is the Elite trim a discount Acura? Not quite. The Elite trim is about $4,000 more than a base MDX, so there's definitely some price overlap between the Honda model and then Honda's premium brand Acura. But the Acura definitely feels more premium and more sporty than what we see in the Pilot. The Pilot tends to feel more utilitarian. The overall driving nature is also different. The MDX feels sharper, it doesn't have as much body roll or as much tip and dive, and even though the engine and transmission are essentially the same, the MDX does feel peppier. There's also an available hybrid if you're looking for a little bit more power and, of course, better fuel economy. The big question I've gotten lately is the MDX worth the upgrade? I would normally say that's a tricky question, but specifically between the Pilot and the MDX, I would actually say yes, because the MDX base price is actually less than those top-end trims of the Pilot. We get those improved driving dynamics. In MDX with all-wheel drive and the tech package, maybe about $3,000 more than the Elite trim, but it has more premium looks and, more importantly, a longer warranty. And that warranty is worth something. By the time you factor that in, it really doesn't cost that much more to step up into the Acura. Then you get a more premium dealer experience, or more premium brand, etc. Top picks are pretty hard in this segment because there are so many solid entries. If you're looking for the best family pick, especially if you have forward-facing child seats in the family, Volkswagen Atlas would definitely be my top pick. If you're looking for the best value, especially in those base trims, if you're looking to spend around $35,000 or less, the Subaru Ascent is quite simply the best deal going. It also has absolutely excellent fuel economy. If you're looking for top overall picks, I have to say that the Kia Sorento is still in the running, but the Honda Pilot also makes a pretty good case for itself. As I noted before, the Pilot is a really good balance in this segment. We have good handling ability, a decent ride, we also have the available seating for 8, which is kind of a handy feature, and reasonable cargo room behind the third row. And of course, if you're looking for something a little bit different, I would definitely recommend the Mazda CX-9. The CX-9 hasn't been selling terribly well in this segment. I think that may be because overall performance is a little bit behind the average entry, but handling ability is really where the CX-9 shines. It's an awful lot of fun to drive, even though it's not quite as swift as some of the other options. And of course, if you're looking to wait a little bit, I would definitely wait for that new Ford Explorer. It's going to be very interesting. It's likely going to be very dynamic. It's also going to be the newest entry in this segment, so be sure and stay tuned for that. In the meantime, be sure and click that subscribe button down there at the bottom of the screen if you haven't already done so. Click up there to the top of your screen if you want to support this channel, and I hope you do. And as always, head over to facebook.com/AlexNautos so you can see what I'm driving this week.